afternoon. Always thought it was harder to speak after lunch, but I guess it's even hard to speak after a tea break before lunch on a delayed session. So I'll try and be on time for a change and buck the trend to get started. Actually, I'm kind of an outlier in this setup today, because the topic that I have is passive and active safety systems. In the connected environment, you might want to wonder, what am I doing? So let me start with the video. The car that you saw is a mid-variant of a model launched about 4 or 5 years ago, which had all active and passive safety systems pre-installed. So if that's the world we live in, the question is, do our standard definitions of passive and active safety make sense today? It mostly does. The question is, what kind of standalone systems are enough? There's a general debate about what's the, let's say, the maximum value of, for example, a passive system having reached in terms of what is the value proposition that it brings for an occupant or a pedestrian. The question is, what happens in the connected environment? And when you look at how the connected vehicle looks like, so this is not a Hollywood slide. With the exception of maybe Wi-Fi hotspot and internet, possibly all of this would be available in a car that one of us is driving. If you're looking at a premium segment, potentially even more features than what is listed on the slide. And if this is the case, then what are the attributes that we need to take care of? And this may have been a standard definition of what we want to do from an active and passive safety system. But I'd argue that this would change a little bit to the green boxes. And this is where the lines between safety and security starts getting blurred. You have to identify what is it that is safe, or how secure is my safety system, and how safe is my security. So we're coming to a point where the lines are getting really blurred in terms of what kind of systems do I need to put into the vehicle. I would also argue that with the megatrends of connected and autonomous, one way to move forward is to do it with the idea of putting more integrated active systems that potentially are talking standalone at this point in time. And that's where we foresee what you see on the slide here. So let's say in the past, in blind and guided systems, you potentially had absolutely no integration between your systems. Your user was, let's say, more important or higher priority than the sensors that you had in the car. And that changes now. So we are talking about your sensor input taking higher precedence than what the user does. In some cases, you have to hand over control between the system and the user. And this is where what you see here, the integration between all your systems becomes more and more interesting. So I'll take you through an example. So if you look at seat belts, which is one form of passive safety that you implement in your vehicle, is a standalone system, or is it? Take an example where you're talking about not an emergency braking assist, but a collision mitigation system. So seat belt now becomes part of an integrated chain. And how do I say that? Assume that you're using adaptive cruise control, the car is driving at 80 kilometers per hour, and a kilometer in front of you, there is something or somebody that obstructs the vehicle. So the vehicle has to identify, the vehicle would then have to potentially brake, and in certain cases also deploy the airbag. What role does the seat belt play in all of this? So if you look at a premium segment vehicle already today, you have what is called seat belt pretensioners. So the seat belt has to retract itself so that the occupants in the vehicle would come back to a physical contour that is then, let's say, allowing the airbags to deploy in the way that it should be, causing minimal damage to what happens to the occupants inside the car. So from that perspective, the systems have to speak to each other. So in the connected environment, whether we like it or not, standalone ECUs or standalone systems would have to speak to each other. So India as a industry or as a segment has always been shy of adopting standards, especially the AutoSAR. And I think we have coming to a point where we have to start cooperating on standards and competing on implementation. If we are not cooperating on standards, we'll quickly get to the point that these systems will burn a big hole into the financial wallets of every single vehicle manufacturer that we are talking about. Unfortunately, it's not just the vehicle alone. So the moment you get to security/safety island, you have to talk about what happens outside the vehicle as well. So the example that I gave, that you're cruising on a highway, now let's exaggerate that a little bit further. What if for some strange reason I decided to also update my, let's say, my braking software at the same time? So I'm driving on the road, just like you have your software OS updates. I get a message, a pop-up on my infotainment screen saying, hey, your ABS potentially can be upgraded. Do you want to do it? And you say yes. And then you realize that you're coming into a tunnel, which means that your GPRS connection potentially from the vehicle is going to be disconnected now. What would you do in such a case? It sounds dramatic, interesting, but can also have very serious and dangerous consequences. And from that perspective, the impacts of what you do or what you bring is far beyond just the vehicle. And the vehicle, unfortunately, is then a part of a connected world. We talk about Internet of Things or IoT. Vehicle is then one possible parameter in a very complex connected environment. And we heard some speakers speak about Industry 4.0. This is also a potential risk to production and manufacturing systems, and not just restricted to the vehicle alone. And that brings me to the point where how safe is your security and how secure is your active and passive safety systems. And that's the point where it starts getting really blurred. You talk about safety, you have to talk about security. They could be in parallel, but it's more like a railway track, so both have to stay together, although they don't meet each other. Privacy, I think it's a debate for a completely different day. So at least at this point in time, the automotive industry is still grappling with what are the consequences of privacy. How do we address this, or how can we address this? Of course, the first is to look at what do you want to do within the organization. So you have to start building more robust vehicle architectures. And the moment you talk about architectures inside a vehicle, you need to get to standards. AutoSAR is one example. Second would be to identify what kind of data usage policies do you want to have within your organization. So what kind of data exchange would you want to do with your partners, with your ecosystem, with your end users? I make the assumption that all the OEMs and the tier ones that are sitting here at least will get the left part right. They have to, otherwise you won't be in business very soon. But the right part is where we need to come together, and that's the environment. And there is a lot of changes that we need to bring in as individual players in the market. The first is we need to start, alliance is maybe an extreme word, but we need to start talking to each other. The less we talk, the greater is, let's say, the financial risk that each of the companies carry for themselves. And we need to talk about the effectiveness of these mitigating solutions. We need to bring in certain ecosystem changes. So connected vehicle, autonomous driving is not just going to impact the automotive world. Real estate, insurance, I can talk about at least 20 to 25 different industries which will undergo a huge disruption and change because of connected and autonomous vehicles. And from that perspective, we need to come to the point where we protect the user rights as well as the industry rights. So government, auto companies, potentially insurance, all of these people have to come together and start talking. And we need to have an environment for information sharing. Last but not the least is to talk about having a learning mindset. So I've been in the automotive industry for 20 years, and the one thing that I've learned very well is that I am the best. At some point in time, we in the automotive industry have to start looking outside and say, maybe we are not really the best. We have to learn from potentially IT companies, aviation in this case, because there is also a standard implemented by aviation for cybersecurity. We need to look outside and see what we need to bring into the automotive industry so that we can bring in the best of the worlds as quickly as we can, so that some of us still stay relevant in the future. That brings me to the end of my slide. I like to believe that the technology has always been there, like one of the panelists told in the morning. For me, the question is not if, but when. But the most exciting part of this journey will be how we do it. And that's the part potentially we'll need to figure out over the next couple of years. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm open for questions now. So.
Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable insights. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to quickly open the floor for Q&A. We'll take about 1 or 2 questions. We'll request you to please put your hands up and we shall pass the mic to you.
As you are talking about active safety features, like some ADAS features you have talked about, like cruise control and blind spot detection or something. So like take an example of lane departure warning system or lane change assist. So in India, we don't have any specified lanes, like what is the definition of lane. So how can we address those issues like customization solution, or when can we expect in India like those features will be available in Indian scenarios?
That's one of the toughest questions to answer. So I like to believe that in the next 5 or 10 years we'll get there, but I'll also wager potentially me not seeing it in my lifetime. But then that's a joke. We need to mark lanes firstly. So we need to get our infrastructure right. There's no question about it. There's a product conclave going on at NASSCOM yesterday and today, and you have a company that talks about not detecting lanes, but potentially detecting the edge of the roads, which means where the road ends abruptly, potentially a footpath. This is one way to solve the problem, but we are complicating it much more than it's needed. So I think this is where the government as well as the industry needs to come together and say, we have to demand that the infrastructure does get better. The technology has its limitations. The challenges will not be in terms of the technical implementation or the information exchange between the vehicle and outside. I think the biggest challenge would be the legal requirements. And we need to come to a point where there's a certain guideline of how the infrastructure and therefore the legal framework looks like.
Yeah, and one more thing, like according to you, what all the features will first introduce? Like ADAS has almost 8 to 9 functions. So what are the most premium functions which you think can be addressed first, like we should launch that?
You mean in India?
Yeah, in India only.
I would argue that potentially all of these features can be introduced in India. The only challenge would be, so I drive a car which has an ultrasound park sensor. It's interesting because when somebody comes 18 inches closer to the vehicle, it starts beeping. It took me 2 days then to switch it off because in India or in Bangalore at least it is continuously beeping. So we need to identify what is a comfort feature and what quickly becomes an annoyance. We also need to look at what kind of radar frequencies India is allowing, and of course what kind of camera technology we want to bring into our vehicle to identify what needs to be implemented. But emergency braking assist, lane departure warning, pedestrian detection, these are features that are already available in some of the vehicles. Maybe they are just, from a software perspective, hidden for the end user. But these can potentially just be, you just need to flash a certain bit which enables these features and it starts running. So,
yeah, thank you.
What do you believe in connected, augmented safety from cloud-enabled, ADAS being enabled from augmented from cloud? Do you see that happening?
It will have to happen. So I personally don't like the fact that it is going to happen because then as an end consumer, when I'm driving my car, I don't want a network server to decide what kind of software updates it needs to do or what kinds of data processing needs to happen from a cloud back to the car. But I think that should happen. So if you look already at the Western world today, we have gone away from the concept of having between 60 to 120 ECUs. You have the concept of domain control now. So you have 8 to 10 ECUs that come together. It's a hypercomputer of sorts. Actually, the industry term is HCP, high computing performance ECUs. These are 8 to 10 ECUs put together running, in some cases, Linux, QNX as an extension. You can also have real-time operating systems. And that also is not enough, unfortunately, to take care of the processing powers that some of the driver assistance features are asking us right now. So instead of putting all the tech into the car, a cheaper solution would be that you do the processing on the cloud. But that means that you need to have continuous communication between the vehicle and the cloud, or identify use cases that we have never thought about before. So I don't have an answer, but I'm scared, let's put it that way. So, and we should all be scared. And looking at, let's say, the talent availability, and India should offer all the talents to solve all the software problems of this world, we need to really start looking at what kind of pipeline we are building with the university and also the people that are coming in to see how we can tackle these problems, because this is a complete paradigm shift.
Thank you so much. Let's give another huge round of applause. Thank you so much, sir, for a very engaging session.